Bienvenue. Merci de vous joindre à nous aujourd'hui. Je m'appelle Jean-Marc Mangin, je suis le PDG de Fondation Philanthropique Canada. Je n'étais pas censé vous adresser la parole aujourd'hui. Mais avant de passer le micro à notre modératrice, Leanne Burton, directrice du développement et des partenariats à MECOE, je me dois d'aborder la macabre découverte de l'enterrement de masse d'enfants sur le terrain d'une ancienne école résidentielle à Kamloops. C'est un moment de jugement pour le Canada, mais aussi pour nous tous, car le système des écoles résidentielles a été établi sous le couvert de la charité et du progrès. The horrors of the system were known right from the start, from the stories that emerged from survivors, from the work of Dr. Price, the first Chief Medical Officer of the Department of the Interior, and our first whistleblower, to the monumental research from the 1996 Royal Commission on the Aboriginal Peoples and the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This evidence convinced the former Chief of the Supreme Court that Canada attempted cultural genocide against Indigenous peoples. A conclusion also endorsed by the Independent National Inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and accepted by our current Prime Minister. Now we know in the most visceral way that Canada failed these children, that the past is not dead, it's not even past. It stains and shapes our country today. More than 80 foundations have signed the Philanthropic Community Declaration of Action in service of reconciliation in support of the TRC calls to action. The Circle on Philanthropy and Aboriginal Peoples, Chris, its CEO, is with us today, is hosting this declaration. But let's be honest, moving from intent to impact has been painfully slow. I urge all of us to reflect on that, to develop the necessary relationships with Indigenous peoples, and to act on the calls to action, which remain as relevant today as they did in 2015. After I make the land acknowledgement in a few seconds, I invite you to join me in a moment of silence. 215 seconds. This is just long enough to reflect on the enormity of the crimes, to become really uncomfortable. I encourage you to embrace this discomfort, the mourning, notably from the survivors, from our Indigenous brothers and sisters, the pain, the shame, the anger, and the crying need for accountability and justice. Let's reflect on how our actions as foundation, as charities, as citizens of this land can support the seeds of change and truly commemorate and honor these children who died from the brutal colonial and racist practices from the government of Canada. Our current governments, representing all of us, must act swiftly to find all the stolen children and to implement the TRC calls to action. Nous aimerions reconnaître la nature autochtone de nombreux territoires de l'île de la Tortue où nous travaillons et résidons. Les peuples autochtones ont vécu dans ces territoires depuis des dizaines de milliers d'années et vivent encore aujourd'hui. En tant que colons, immigrants et leurs descendants, et en tant que visiteurs, nous honorons et nous respectons tous les peuples autochtones de ce territoire et nous espérons un avenir plus juste ensemble. Thank you. Let's embrace our pain. Let's assume our history and act individually and collectively. And today's discussion will hopefully help all of us to explore some of the ways that philanthropy can better support the public good. And on that note, over to you, Leanne.
Thank you, Jean-Marc. It is my pleasure to be able to help facilitate this conversation today. It's incredibly relevant as the COVID-19 pandemic continues to intensify inequality, horrific evidence of attempted genocide of Aboriginal peoples emerge, and systemic racial inequities continue to come to the fore. Several nonprofit leaders are asking private philanthropy to do more and to do better. Today, we hope to have a courageous conversation about the key barriers and opportunities for private philanthropy to enable the catalytic change that is needed right now. First, I would like to introduce this panel of brilliant minds who bring a diversity of viewpoints to the conversation, ranging from various forms of community philanthropy to both public and private foundations. Claire Trottier, member of the Resource Movement and director of the Trottier Family Foundation. Welcome. Jacques Blayamar, director, grants and racial equity strategy at Calgary Foundation, and a working group member to establish the Foundation for Black Communities. Welcome, Jacques. And Chris Archie, who creates space for transformation of philanthropy in her role as the CEO of the Circle on Philanthropy. So we're looking forward to having a really great conversation, and we also wanted to include our attendees as well too. If you'd like to introduce yourself in the Q&A, and if you have questions throughout the conversation, please do pop them in there, and we'll try and make space for them either throughout the conversation, or we do have some time reserved at the end as well too. So first, before we get started, we really want to acknowledge that the term private philanthropy represents a pretty large ecosystem of giving, receiving, and sharing. So today we're going to focus on what we will refer to as settler philanthropy. And I'll invite Chris to say a little bit more about why this is an important distinction. Chris, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Leanne, and thank you, PFC, for your thoughtful consideration of the children whose bodies were found in Secwepemc, which is actually my nation and my home territory. I'm really fortunate to actually be home in my territory right now, being able to participate in that communal healing that is necessary for my own well-being, while also continuing to do the work that is required, because even in my own territory, the notion of taking the time is never unbound from the requirement to be of service. So I'm glad to be here today. So what I'd like to say about settler philanthropy is, well, first of all, that the Circle, we worked very hard to make that, to create that language in order to help the folks in the sector recognize that from an Indigenous perspective, when we're talking about philanthropy, we need to make a distinguishment between what is known as settler philanthropy versus the ongoing continuation of practices and laws related to Indigenous generosity and reciprocity. And so we use the language settler created philanthropy to indicate organizations whose wealth was created on the lands and on the backs of Indigenous peoples, not only in this country, but in other countries. This also extends to the fact that many organizations have endowments, and they have investment assets. And those investment assets and endowments are actually continuations of harm on Indigenous peoples and their lands, both here in Canada and globally. And so we want to make that language explicit, because it requires looking inward. It requires some truth-telling about the historical origins of where wealth comes from in this country. And without a deeper understanding about that, I think that it it's misplaced to have a conversation as it relates to philanthropy and its service to justice. First, we must reckon with the history that exists. And so I'm very appreciative for the opportunity to just give folks a little bit more information on that, but to also invite people to use that language for the explicit purpose that we created it, which is to increase more conversation and more honesty about the ongoing harm that happens.
Thank you, Chris. And I also wanted to follow up here with a question around whether you have thoughts on the concept of public good. This is very much what grounds the charitable sector and charitable objects for foundations and operating charities. Do you have any thoughts on what public good really means?
So many thoughts, Leanne, so many thoughts. I think, first I must acknowledge that there is a really brilliant and bold intern that PFC had, who was part of our preparation conversation. And she really helped solidify some of the thinking. And so I'm happy to just bring this forward. This notion of public good is something that needs to be reevaluated on the regular. And this atrocity in Kamloops, which we know is just one of what will continue to be many, 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 is a prime example of good intentions gone wrong. It is a prime example of the notion that the public good, 150 years ago and 100 years ago and 50 years ago, was to educate the Indians, was to make sure that they, integrated into white society. And the federal government was involved in contracting with a variety of religious organizations to run and operate those Indian residential schools. And the settler philanthropic sector in this country was absolutely engaged in helping fund and flow money through. I know of at least one organization that has taken the time to look back and say, did we give money to Indian residential schools? And absolutely they did. So I think this notion of, troubling the concept is important, because the best of intentions, when we look back in time, can be demonstrably horrific. And so I'm appreciative that we're creating an opportunity for folks to be thinking about this, and also to be questioning who is actually defining social good. Who is defining public good? Who is benefiting when we use this language? And how are we actually shifting and wielding power differently based on the history of this sector?
Thank you. I also invite the panelists to jump in at any moment if you're inspired to share some thoughts. Please do so. I mean, we do want to spend the next little bit talking about some of the hot button issues that are emerging in the sector. There's quite a few, and so I just invite the group to kind of bring them up popcorn style. We can pull apart a few if we feel inspired to go down any particular road today. So I will bring it open. Jack, I see you've gone off mute, so please.
Yeah, thanks, Leanne. And I wanted to start off by thanking Chris for taking the time to be a part of this conversation and sharing your wisdom despite everything that you're going through. So hand to heart for that. And also wanted to talk about, in terms of public good, that everyone that's involved in philanthropy, whether it's as donors, as board members, as volunteers, as staff, we need to embrace that discomfort that Jean-Marc talked about, and to really reflect on, yes, we engage in philanthropy with a mindset of doing good for community. I'm a good person, I want to help with community, but that it's possible that two things can exist within that reality, that in wanting to do good for community, we're also upholding systemic inequities and injustice that exists and leaving people out. And we have blind spots, and sometimes in wanting to uphold this an identity that we have of ourselves or the organization that we work for as being essentially good organizations that are here for the public good, we ignore what community is trying to tell us. We ignore, often, primarily, we ignore the voices of Indigenous communities. We ignore the voices of Black communities. We ignore the voices of other racialized communities that are saying, here's an injustice that exists. Here's the resources that we need. Here's the changes, transformational changes that we want to see, because we're trying to uphold essentially an image of ourselves and of our organization. And so really the need to embrace that discomfort. And I also want to distinguish between discomfort and lack of safety. There's a big difference between that. So, being uncomfortable, it does not mean I'm not safe. And we may be in spaces where we're called upon to really reflect on decisions that we've made, and decisions that we're continuing to make. And that discomfort, it does not equate to the lack of safety that communities are facing, that, at the forefront, that these children were facing, right? So I think, we really need to be also thinking about, the power and privilege that comes with the control over making decisions within philanthropy, and every single person involved in a philanthropic organizations has level of decision making that they're involved in, and which has an impact on community. And that we have a significant voice in determining what is public good. We get to, as I'm saying we because I'm part of philanthropic organizations, and I'm part of this system, and I'm saying there's a mindset as funders that as stewards of funds, essentially we know better than community what is needed and what's worthy of support. And that concept of worthiness of support is very troublesome, because what is deemed worthy has, we've seen has evolved over years, and is determined by whoever is in power. So that's what I wanted to start off by saying. Thanks.
Thank you, Chaka. Claire, did you go off mute there? Would you like to say something?
Yeah, sure. I can add a few thoughts. Thank you very much for having me. So I think that the perspective that I bring to the table here is, as a white settler engaged really in settler philanthropy, I think, I'm definitely aware of the systems of privilege that I benefit from, and I think that the question of power that you mentioned, Jaka, is something that's definitely on my mind a lot. I think that people who have access to wealth and power like me have an outsized voice and outsized ability to impact things that's really disproportionate and not necessarily reflective of what we might try to define as the public good. And there's a lot of, I think, really legitimate critiques of philanthropy. I think that philanthropy can be a part of a solution and can contribute constructively to addressing community needs, but it often is not. And I think that it's while it can be part of the solution, it's certainly not the only solution. A lot of my, I think, thinking about some of the problems of philanthropy were, I think, really well described by Anand Giridharadas in his book, Winners Take All. And for me, I think the central thesis of that book has really been a guiding light for me, and that's generosity is not a substitute for justice. It's great to be generous. I think we should be more generous. I think we should be smarter about the way that we use our dollars, our power, and all of our resources. But there are deeper structural issues that need to be addressed and that have to be addressed sometimes separate from philanthropy. And because we all exist in the broader system, I think it's also a smart idea to try to engage in those other types of conversations about what is the system in which we find ourselves in philanthropy, what's the broader system, and what are some other changes that need to happen. And some of the changes that I think need to happen are changes to our tax system, for example. So I'm part of a group called Resource Movement, and I'm involved with some other groups like Millionaires for Humanity, calling for a wealth tax and other changes to try to create a more just and equitable system. Yeah, I'll leave it at that for now.
I think you just gave a tremendous list of resources that I hope the facilitators at PFC are going to share in the chatter. It looks like they're already on it. Wonderful. Wow. And also just Claire, in response to your quote from Anand, also the idea of giving back. I feel like the intentions are so great, but what that implies also is that we'll give back a small amount after we already took a lot, right? And we should really, I think, consider that language and what we mean by giving back. I wanted to maybe ask anybody on this panel if they have any thoughts on this sort of emerging conversation around endowments, and what the social benefit would be to preserve the capital for the long term, or to spend down and deploy resources right now at this critical time in Canadian society. Does anybody have any thoughts?
I would be happy to add, though I have to put it in the context of having a very particular voice on this issue. The Circle on Philanthropy definitely is a fan of encouraging organizations to spend down endowments. And if it means that they first have to just get better at dispersing more, then fine, like there's some incremental change that can happen. But particularly in Indigenous communities, there are certainly some teachings and laws in a variety of places that tell us warning stories about greed and about what happens when you hoard and what happens when you keep for yourselves and you don't distribute to others. And we recently did supported and were involved in a project called Restoring Philanthropy. That will come out in a few months. But we heard the stories of Indigenous people related to hoarding and greed, and the lessons that exist in that space are very clear. That the way in which endowments exist today is not actually in alignment with many Indigenous cultural values and practices that still exist today. That the notion of holding on to something in perpetuity, but that actually the bigger amount is what you're holding on to, and you're kind of putting out little bits and pieces, is effectively unethical. It's not okay. And that when you behave like that, there are consequences. There are natural laws that step into place and that cause a reckoning. And so in lots of ways, I think we're in a period of time in the sector, in settler philanthropy, where there is an opportunity to confront a reckoning and actually make some really fantastic and dramatic change. And so although I recognize that there are lots of reasons that endowments can bring value, I do have concerns that predominantly organizations are, sitting on more wealth and managing more wealth than they are actually giving grants.
Thank you, Chris. Has anybody had experience with alternative forms of philanthropy aside from maybe not aside from, as an alternative to the endowment model? Any great examples for those who are listening here and wondering what the options are?
You mean in terms of the actual endowment, like how to use the funds in your endowment?
Well, or maybe choosing not to set up an endowment, certainly not one in the spirit of perpetuity. How might you approach philanthropy today, maybe in a different way?
I think I would love to hear from Jacka about the Foundation for Black Communities and their approach to both endowment building, but also how they're steeping their decision-making in community. I think that is a fantastic example.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, the Foundation for Black Communities is first of its kind in Canada, a philanthropic foundation that is led by and focused on Black communities across Canada, and really rooted in decentralized, local, community-based decision-making. It's about encouraging and supporting self-determination of Black communities in Canada, and putting the resources within the hands of those communities to decide for themselves what is needed in their communities. And the foundation has decided to use an endowment model, and it's not and I think it's also important for us to distinguish between an endowment in perpetuity versus like a long-term endowment. And it's more towards a long-term endowment to ensure, resources that are sustainable, because Black communities have been suffering from sporadic, inconsistent, and minimal resources going to their communities. So that need for an actual resource that is within the hands of communities is really important. And I think it's important to see the distinctions, and that there's ways to do endowments differently, and to ensure that those resources are not being held within the hands of few, but within the hands of many. And so it's really a community-based approach.
Mm-hmm. And also so that the decisions that are being made by those for which the funds are intended, and
Absolutely.
not that you know.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. And is there an investment plan for this endowment that also will benefit communities, or is that sort of a longer range thinking?
Yeah, that's also part of the conversation of like, how do you use the investments through, impact investments that are also giving back to Black communities. So investing in Black-led social enterprises and other, social impact initiatives that will continue to grow a stronger ecosystem within Black communities.
Awesome. And Claire, I think you have a bit of experience in this area. Maybe you could offer your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, we do have an endowment, and one of the ways we've approached our endowment has been using sort of a climate lens, beginning with divestment from fossil fuel and extractive industries, and moving also towards reducing our carbon footprint over time, and engaging in practices to try to, I guess, reduce the harm that are endowment, because I think that the endowments that we hold, we're invested in all kinds of different funds, and the systems that we live in are I think unfair. But I guess one way to reduce the harm is to try to, at least with the climate lens, reduce our impact on climate change, and try to, through our impact investments, which we also engage in, fund solutions and technologies to help facilitate a just transition. So that's really been the lens that we've employed at the level of the endowment. At the moment, it is an endowment in perpetuity. Yeah, I think it goes back to sort of the decision-making power, and fundamentally the decisions get made at the board level, and that's the decision that the board has made at this time. We are also, trying to spend more now. We spend well above the minimum quota. I think this year we're spending, I want to say, over 10% of the endowment. And part of it was in response to COVID-19, which I think has for those who weren't already aware, I think opened a lot of eyes towards a lot of the inequalities in our society. So a lot of it was directed there, but a lot of it is also directed towards climate programs, because we see that as a very significant crisis. And so, holding on to all of the assets for a rainy day is kind of silly when it's pouring. So, trying to mobilize more of those funds over a shorter horizon is part of our priorities.
And the climate crisis being a human rights crisis as well, that is becoming more of a mainstream thinking as well too. So I'm seeing more foundations taking a more holistic view. Let's maybe switch gears to the disbursement quota. There's been some indications. Yep.
Can I hop in quickly, Leanne? One thing I just wanted to add on to what Claire was saying is I just wanted to share with folks, and I put a link in the chat. that there's a really great initiative that is, one of our members is involved in. There's a handful, actually, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous members, which is about reconciliation and responsible investment. And so there's guidelines for and resources for folks who are trying to think about how to use a reconciliation-focused lens as well for their investment screening. And then the other thing that I would just point to that I think was a really big win is the work that NATOA, that Share, and Atkinson Foundation recently did just a couple of weeks ago. So, NATOA and Atkinson are members of the Circle. We're very proud to have them as members of the Circle, and they did something that was quite catalytic. And so just wanted to point people in that direction as well. That this particular screen is taking into consideration, land and water protection and human rights and a whole range of things that don't just benefit Indigenous communities, but in fact benefit, all of both the walking and the living beings.
Thank you, Chris. Wonderful. If we're okay to switch to the topic of the disbursement quota as well too. I know it's a really hot topic right now with a lot of opinions floating around. I'd love to hear from this group what your thoughts are on a potential increase in the disbursement quota and whether that would be of a benefit to the sector and the issues that are so prevalent right now. We don't know how much it might be. Just indications that there might be one coming. Would this be helpful in terms of social inequities that we're facing right now?
I'm happy to speak to that really quickly. I mean, one, on the outset, absolutely. I mean, we at the Circle, about a year and a half ago, we had a little mini campaign called the Other 95. People were talking about like raising the disbursement quota to 5%. And we're like, wait a second, let's have a conversation about where the other 95% is sitting and actually how that can be activated for social good. One of the concerns that I have is that more money is not just the answer. More money that continues to flow disproportionately to settler-led and to white-led organizations on behalf of the beneficiaries that are like Indigenous or Black or racialized or other equity-seeking folks is not the answer. And so I'm a fan of increasing the disbursement quota. I think that although there's some voices saying that there's not enough data about the sustainability of it, I think we have to ask ourselves who's doing that research and who benefits from that idea. It is not Indigenous organizations and the communities whose land and backs help create that wealth. And so I do think that's important to consider. And apologies for the translation for my passionate response and the speed of it.
Thank you, Chris. Passion, always welcome. Jalka, do you have anything that you wanted to contribute to this disbursement quota discussion?
Yeah, other than, I guess, wholeheartedly agreeing with what Chris was saying, but also that there is a need to shift the regulations around it, because I think if we're left to regulate it ourselves, we are going to continue with status quo, and status quo is leaving behind many people, and is not it's not fulfilling its contract, right, with communities. So their foundations receive and the donors receive the tax benefit, which is a subsidy, a government subsidy for that tax benefit, which, and how are we living up to that contract then that we have towards that benefit? Is it enough to say that we're giving out a little piece of it every year, and being focused on like perpetual growth, right? Like, who said that perpetual growth is what is beneficial for our community, when it's at the expense of people who are still suffering just to get, begging to get a little piece of what's being offered, right? Like, and I really want to highlight what Chris was saying about just adding more money, but continuing to do things the same is not really going to solve the issues at hand, because due to lack of representation, lack of relationships, as well as, systemic racism that exists, Black, Indigenous, and other racialized communities are struggling to access the resources that are currently being offered. So, having more is not necessarily going to address that. And it really comes from a scarcity mindset, as opposed to really thinking about the abundance of wealth and resources that do exist in our community, and how do we ensure that they are being used in an equitable fashion.
Claire.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think that we should absolutely be increasing the minimum disbursement quota. I think that to me is really obvious. And I completely agree with you, Jacka, that it has to be like a regulated requirement. I think a lot of the things that we're talking about today, require people to make that decision themselves and to self-regulate and to, in many cases, like remove power from yourself. And I think some people will do that, some foundations will do that at different levels at different speeds, and that's good. You need progress, and progress is not all going to happen in a huge leap in lockstep, but I think fundamentally a lot of the issues that we're dealing with, sometimes glacial, that's fair, and sometimes backing up anyway, so I do think that you need sort of a regulatory change to address a lot of these issues. So, absolutely having a higher minimum disbursement quota is necessary. And then to tie into that piece about like, how do you use that additional, where is that additional money going? Who's deciding where it goes? Again, like you're increasing that, you're saying, let's say 5% or whatever, the same decision makers are in charge of making that decision. So again, you're back to sort of asking people. So, I mean, I think, we do need to ask people to have that reflection and ask those hard questions and change their behavior. But, I think that you need to be moving towards a direction where some of that is also thought about differently, like the philanthropic sector, you make a donation, you get a tax deduction. So, the taxpayer is sort of subsidizing a lot of philanthropic activity. So I think that there's some reflection to be had there about how do we ensure that the funds that are being spent are done in a way that is not further contributing to inequity, right? And giving a really kind of drilled down concrete example. I live here in Jujagwe, Montreal, and there's some analysis that's been done about different neighborhoods in Montreal and community organizations in those neighborhoods that receive philanthropic dollars, and neighborhoods like Montréal Nord, which is a sort of low socioeconomic neighborhood, high percentage of BIPOC residents, receives a much lower proportion of dollars relative to their population, and certainly relative to their needs, which is greater than the neighborhood I live in, certainly. So we need to be looking at even at like the sort of like local level, how do we make decisions about how to allocate funds and where those funds are most needed, have most impact, and are managed directly by communities.
As you're talking, I'm just thinking about how we started this conversation around the concept of public benefit and who decides what is public benefit. And the way that the capital is flowing or not flowing is an indicator of who's benefiting and who's not. And so I wonder then, let's say if it were the disbursement where quota was increased to 5%, would this group be happy with that? Do you think that's enough? What could be done with that? Or is that not enough?
I kind of just scoffed a little bit. I absolutely don't think that's enough. I think that it's a bare minimum that people should be embarrassed about. I think that broadly, if if people in this country understood that settler-created philanthropic institutions were only required to give 5% of their interest earned income every year, I think they would be up in arms. Because if we know how much good they do already, think about how much more they could do with a higher disbursement quota. And then I want to just link back to this, to what Claire said about, even when we know the truth, whether it's the work of Foundation for Black Communities and their unfunded report, whether it's the 2 pieces of research that the Circle did about how many dollars go to Indigenous organizations, or whether it's to the research that just happened in Montreal, the data enough doesn't actually make people change their decision, because it doesn't have actually a real consequence on their own lives. And so without a very bold regulation that says this is ridiculous and we must change this, I don't think people will self-regulate to a point that actually has benefit to my community and to our members. That being said, I know we'll get some pushback by folks who are going to be up in arms and say, we give 10%, we give 15%. Great, you can give 20 and 30. Like, I don't want to give kudos for the scarcity thinking and for continuing to do the bare minimum when you could give 100%. You're sitting on millions or billions of dollars. So I just wanted to add that the data alone doesn't actually add value and institute change. It can't be self-regulated. And then just additionally, it's partly why the Circle is not interested in continuing to do this research that says less than 1% of philanthropic dollars go to Indigenous organizations. It's because even when you do that work, it doesn't dramatically change the outcome. So we've instead focused on supporting our members to do their own, shared learning and data and research to understand where their dollars go, how they differentiate the difference between Indigenous-led, Indigenous-informed, and Indigenous benefiting. Because we want to work with folks who can do their own analysis, because we cannot wait for the federal government to provide the regulation to do that work well. So we've got to work with the folks who are willing.
Well said. Thank you, Chris. From what I'm getting from this conversation is that it is about the capital and the amount of funds flowing to communities, but it's also how the funds flow and who's making the decision. And so in the last maybe 5 years, maybe even less, at least since COVID took the shape that it has taken, the concept of trust-based philanthropy has become more mainstream. And there are varying interpretations of what that means. And so I'd love to put it out to the panelists here to just share what your perspective is of what trust-based philanthropy should be or shouldn't be. And feel free to share examples.
I guess I wanted to start off by, talking about, for example, the trust-based philanthropy project, which outlines, different characteristics of trust-based philanthropy. So giving multi-year unrestricted funding, funders doing the homework and taking on the responsibility of getting to know prospective grantees, simplifying, streamlining the paperwork and the application process, being really transparent and responsive, soliciting and acting on feedback, and then offering support beyond, the funds. And I think those are important steps to take as a funder and as a philanthropic organization. And they're also incremental steps. So if we're really looking for a transformational trust-based philanthropy, that looks like transferring significant portions of capital within community control and decision-making. That means like removing ourselves from that decision-making and trusting community that they know what is best for the communities that they're working with, because they're living it days to day, and removing that idea that we somehow have to keep that control over it, because it really ties back to this thinking that paternalistic thinking that somehow we know better, than those that are living, the realities day to day. So it also looks to following the leadership of racialized communities and supporting the initiatives that they're already undertaking and giving them the resources they need to act accordingly, and to listen to what they're saying. So yeah, I think that's what I would see as like really moving to a more transformational trust-based philanthropy.
It almost seems like social equity is impossible unless that how capital flows is addressed and who's making the decisions.
Yeah, can I share as well that I recently, I was on a panel conversation at the Environment Funders Canada conference with an amazing fellow named Jonas Hassan. And so I'm just going to drop the link to their organization in the chat. It was the first time I'd heard of Justice Fund. It was the first time I heard about these pillars for philanthropic reform. And I was so delighted. I was like, oh my goodness, we need to connect. Fingers crossed that we have some of their voices at our upcoming conference. But I think that this is actually a much more interesting kind of provocative conversation. Their first pillar is that the disbursement quota from 3.5% to 10% immediately. And they really are trying to take a more comprehensive view, a systemic view to how to actually reform philanthropy. So really appreciate their work and just wanted to give it a shout out. And then what I would say about trust philanthropy, I've been like on the record saying this before. Future of Good did an article that I said, yes, I'm stoked that folks are excited about trust-based philanthropy, but we still have a problem in Canada about racism and about like denying influence and power. And until that's dealt with, trust-based philanthropy actually continues to just be another framework with a really rotten foundation. At its core, right? The wood is going to just fall away and it will all collapse. And so instead of moving too quickly to that, it's like take the time to understand how ready your organization is to truly embed trust-based philanthropic principles. On the one hand, we could say that largely the settler-created philanthropic sector is a trust-based philanthropic sector. It's just that it's mostly trusting white-led, male-led organizations across this country, and they give grants, to large institutions, hospitals, and universities all the time. So I think that we have to first be honest about what the behavior is currently and how we might pivot. So additionally, I would say the kinds of trust-based philanthropy that we're seeing with our members are ones that deeply center Indigenous voices, wisdom, and relationships, that take the time to make sure that their organization is doing their own practice and policy change internally, while supporting the wisdom of Indigenous people to make real decisions about real amounts of money, not 5,000 or 15,000, like hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of money. It's actually possible. So the Catherine Donnelly Foundation has been trying to create a pooled fund for the Healing on the Land initiative that's not getting traction because people are saying, it's taking so long. Like, yes, because the relationships require that. And so if you want to move quick, then go ahead and like dissolve yourself with the actual transformation, and that's still important, but recognize that trust-based philanthropic behavior has teachings and laws that are still in action in Indigenous communities. And so there's a lot of pathways forward that can be learned from the work that we see in Indigenous communities that could be picked up by settler philanthropy and activated in practice and policy.
We can only move at the speed of trust. I've heard that said before quite a few times. So Chris, let me ask you really quickly then, given that philanthropy or settler philanthropy is inherently a colonial construct, is there a way, based on what you just said, is there a way for equity to prevail in Canadian society inside this sort of colonial construct? What would that look like, or what needs to happen?
Well, I mean, that's definitely a longer conversation, but a few quick points would be that instead of organizations starting their own like Indigenous advisory and hiring an Indigenous staff person, what you could do is actually just start getting money out the door to the Indigenous-led organizations that already exist, that are already chronically underfunded, and that are already because of the essence of the work that they do, because of their origin stories, because of their commitment and accountability to their communities, they are already behaving equitably. They are already oriented towards justice and liberation that not only serves their communities, but it also serves like the broad community. So forget like the internal hand-wringing and how we, take care of things, and let's get some more advisors and some more board members. Yes, that's helpful. Keep doing that. But you can also write checks and get them out the door a heck of a lot quicker than you're doing right now. And if you don't know how to begin, the Circle on Philanthropy actually exists specifically to do that work. It's to support organizations to do that work. So no one gets away with saying that they don't know how to begin. It's like, hey guys, we're over here. Come join us.
Always a welcome table at the Circle. There's some questions. I want to invite attendees to put some questions in the Q&A. We're happy to go anywhere, I think, in this conversation. There are some questions around about giving to non-qualified donees. There's a private members bill that has been put through to include non-qualified donees in charitable activities. I'd love to put it up to the group on what your thoughts are. Claire, maybe also as a private foundation representative.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, this is such a major issue. One of our central pillars at our foundation is focused on climate change. And, there's so many amazing grassroots groups doing mobilization on this issue. And very, very difficult to find a way to fund them without, getting in trouble with the CRA, right? So I think that this is a very, very important issue. Again, going back to sort of policy and, in order to give funds to organizations like that, you have to have these agreements, which like give you power and control. Like the whole thing is just, there's work to be done there for sure. I think that, we've tried to do some work to support organizations like that. But I think that in order to have greater impact, we would need to have regulatory change because it really limits the ability of private foundations to be able to support communities if they don't have that charitable status. Yeah.
Is there a downside, if any, to being able to support non-qualified donees?
I mean, maybe there are, I can't think of any, but maybe Chuck and Chris can come up with some. I mean, I don't know of any. Right now, our lack of ability to support those types of organizations, I think, is a problem, and hampers, I think, the ability to transfer funds to groups that are doing excellent work and give them that independence and decision-making power to pursue their agenda. It really limits our ability to do that type of work. And it limits also the ability for new organizations that are coming up. I think it also reinforces sort of support for existing organizations, many of whom are doing excellent work and also, need support. But I think it also makes it much more difficult for newer organizations to kind of get off the ground and have enough financial support to be able to carry out their activities.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to add there as well that, when Senator Ratna Omadvar was doing some work, she contacted the Circle to say, like, what is the experience of your members? And so, we helped put together some information that essentially said, like, on the part of philanthropic institutions, they're creating all kinds of back ways into helping fund organizations that oftentimes puts an added administrative burden on organizations. They have to become service contracts, or, there's creative ways that money gets out the door. So we know that's happening, and everyone's being quiet about it. But it means if you're quiet about it, that we can actually demonstrate that there are ways to do it and learn from it and be open about it. But the other thing is, one of our members is the MasterCard Foundation. MasterCard Foundation did their own internal research and identified that they spent $1 million on direction and control administration. That could have been grant dollars. And so every single organization that is managing the administrative burden is using funds and human resources time and adding administrative burden to organizations that is both paternalistic and colonial, that could be done away with. So I would definitely love to see that happen. happen. And then just to add on, there's a reason that there are a whole host of organizations that choose not to be charitable, not only because they would never qualify, but it's because the moment that you become charitable, there are absolutely some bounds to what you can and can't say, what you can and can't advocate for. Well, let's take a moment and think about who's out in the world right now advocating for human rights. Who's advocating for land and water protection? Who's advocating for Indian residential school survivors? Who is advocating for the fair treatment of people in the health and justice system? These are people who are putting their own necks and bodies and wisdom out on the line. And it says something that if our regulatory system in this country can't honor people who are about human rights and land and water rights, and making them eligible to be supported to do their good work and to build their movements and to help us into a better country, to be a better country. I think that itself is an indication that we have a problem brewing, and it can be rectified. In the chat, there was someone named Natalie who posted a great idea, why aren't philanthropic organizations actually paying the tax? You're going to get into a bit of trouble, but probably you can afford that trouble. So why not just do it? We've been saying to folks all the time, we would love to see one of our members give money to non-qualified donees to declare it and then figure out what kind of ding they're going to get. Is it actually too much money that you can't afford it? Is it worth it? What happens when you do it? We need someone to step into that and say, we're going to be willing to do it. We're going to make this learning visible for everyone. Because until it happens, we can just pretend to be scared of it.
Yeah, and I think there's growing realization that the majority of organizations that are led by racialized individuals are not registered charities or qualified donees, and therefore are very limited in their access to philanthropic dollars. Ultimately, then, if we're saying we want to be moving towards greater equity in philanthropy and grant making, we need to really look at one of the biggest hurdles to accessing this huge pool of resources that exist in Canada. $85 billion sitting in the philanthropic sector, and a large portion of organizations that are doing the work that Chris talked about are not able to access those resources. And then in a conversation, recently with a foundation, they were talking about how this idea that we have that if a charitable entity has received that status from CRA, that somehow that gives them that gives us a certain level of comfort as a funder that they've gone through some level of scrutiny. But that's removing a lot of onus in terms of relationship building with the organizations to really see what is the work they're actually doing. Are they connected with community? How can we actually be engaging with them in a way that is really about partnership and relationship? And that piece is missing when you're basing it purely on that charitable status. There's a lot of the heavy lifting is happening in grassroots organizations that are really on the front line, like Chris was talking about. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Jacka. There's an awesome question here. Is the tax benefit that donors receive so important that the CRA needs to impose so much regulatory restrictions on how the funds are used? It's a big question.
I was getting excited about the chat, and I
exactly.
actually
Me too. Can you repeat
I think we're all
it?
reading the side chat.
I just wanted to add one other point, if that's okay, just on the. My understanding also, and maybe this is really just we meet with these lawyers that advise us on what we can and cannot do, and what are we just going to pay a fine if we do what you suggested, which I think is this is an interesting idea. What would happen if we gave money to a non-qualified donee and declared it? I don't know, but my understanding from our lawyers is that we would have our charitable status revoked ourselves. I don't know if that's true. I guess we would have to take a chance, and that would be a pretty big chance. But anyway, I sort of digress here. The point that I wanted to bring forward is also that the sort of definition of what are charitable activities is also super narrow. And I saw in the chat somebody talking about, religious organizations. Religious organizations count, right? But lots of other types of activities that I consider to be absolutely essential for the good of society are not considered legitimate in the eyes of our federal government. So yeah, I have a lot of beefs with the CRA.
Again, I want to add on to that as well, because folks are talking about non-qualified donees, and we also know that there's the qualified donee status, of which many people purport that, like, you can fund Indigenous communities, just get them to be qualified donees. And so, first of all, read the language around that. It requires communities to be considered, to consider themselves, a body performing municipal type services. And we're talking about nations, not municipalities. The resistance to becoming qualified donees is very real. The time in which that came forward was a time in which the federal government was trying to impose financial management requirements and legislation that were taking back the authority and the self-governance of Indigenous communities across this country. Indigenous leaders were like, whoa, we already give you enough of our financial information. Thank you very much. You don't get access to more. The other thing to add about going through the process of becoming a qualified donee, and someone mentioned in the chat that Muslim-led organizations face additional scrutiny. That happens basically for Indigenous organizations and any other equity-seeking organizations. And I said to the advisory committee on the charitable sector, the problem is that the folks who are in the CRA, lovely humans, I'm sure, do not have the worldview and the actual knowledge to make the decisions about who actually could or could not be qualified donees. And I think that's a bigger problem. I've said it to that group, I've said it to the CRA, I'll continue to say it, that until they have folks with the proper knowledge making those assessments, we will continue to face undue scrutiny, and that the actual issue of Indigenous communities becoming qualified donees has to be recognized as actually a larger issue related to other federal legislation that was problematic and that requires communities to give up a level of financial scrutiny that many of our own charitable organizations would not be willing to do.
I just wanted to add, because you're talking about financial scrutiny, and I think, when we're talking about power and control, that comes with decision making, there's often concerns about, well, how are we going to know that the funds won't be misspent, that the group will have the capacity to manage the funds, to do what they say they're going to do. And I think we need to really challenge that thinking and compare that risk versus the risk of continuing status quo of people who are not connected to issues, continuing to make decisions about where resources should go, and what is the impact of that, and which one is a greater risk ultimately.
Great point, Jaka. There's another question kind of connected to that here is, why is it considered not charitable to prevent people from getting into poverty, but it is charitable to support individuals once they're impoverished? The logic doesn't seem.
Yeah, this is one of the examples that are one of the lawyers that advises our foundation gave us. My understanding is it went to court actually, and some organization had their status revoked, and I can't remember the details. Somebody, I'm sure in the chat, will tell me. But it's bananas. Anyway, that's all I have to say about that.
We have about 6 minutes left. I'd love to invite all the wonderful panelists to help us close with a call to action to any body of the sector or the sector at large on how to show up for communities that need the support right now.
One of the things I would like to add is just that, in less than 2 weeks, the Circle is hosting our biannual conference called All My Relations. It's a 3-day gathering. If you haven't already invited your Indigenous grantees to attend, then you please should. There's no rate, there's no cost for their attendance. There will be a myriad of Indigenous organizations talking about and highlighting and amplifying the work that they're doing. And so if you care about the 215 children's bodies, if you purport to care about the Declaration for Action, there's no reason why you shouldn't be at that conference, June 14th to 16th. And so the information has been shared. Additionally, if you would like to be part of a cohort-based year-long learning experience, we have one called the Partners in Reciprocity. Applications will open again this fall, and it's a chance for you to learn alongside your peers and within a team inside of your institution how to actually have the personal leadership to change policy practice, to invest in people, understand place with an analysis for power. And so that is deeply embedded in the Declaration for Action. All of the data that people are learning and gathering will be made public at our fall feast, which is happening in November. So that's where we'll be sharing the 4 years worth of research, shared learning, and data related to policy and practices. And we invite folks to learn about it, attend these gatherings, and if you're not already a member, to become a member. Thank you.
Agreed. Shameless plug for the Circle, and also Partners in Reciprocity. Make ways participating in that, and I've heard amazing things about what they're learning and the relationships that are being built there. And this work is never ever done. I think at Make Way we'd like to think that we're fairly developed in our awareness of how to support communities and who we can what we can do to support, and looking inward at what we're doing to perpetuate. It's never done. There's so much to be done. And so thank you to the Circle for leading those conversations. Jacka?
Yeah, so I guess I just want to reiterate and actually name to become a member of the Circle, and to actively engage in the transformational approach to philanthropy that they are leading, that is rooted in Indigenous worldviews and Indigenous practice of philanthropy. And then also to partner with the Foundation for Black Communities and engage in transformational trust-based philanthropy through a transfer of capital to be controlled by Black communities, and to reflect on, who are we accountable to? Are we accountable to our board members, or are we accountable to community? So really reflect on, and what does that actually look like? And ultimately, engaging with community initiatives that are led by and focused on Indigenous and racialized communities.
Thank you so much for those very clear calls to action, and I'm going to follow up on some of those. Claire, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, for me, being, a board member in a family foundation, I think I'm very aware of the fact that we do hold a lot of power, and that, change is definitely difficult, and I think glacial is definitely a word that I would use. And I think that, we need to be having more of these difficult conversations and trying to push our peers to do more. And I think it also goes back to my point earlier about the sort of the system in which we exist, and some foundations will move quickly and far, and some will move slowly and not very far. And if we really want to have a vision that's aligned with both Jacka and Chris have highlighted today, I think that we do need some change at the regulatory level, to be honest. So I think that also using our voice to speak to those issues, and to keep pushing the envelope in that direction. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Claire. This has been, from my perspective, a fantastic conversation today. I've been really feeling the energy in this conversation. I hope that we can keep going with it, and we can do more and do better together. I see Jean-Marc's put on his camera. Maybe you wanted to say something in closing, Jean-Marc.
Yeah, just briefly, just big thank you to the full panel. I knew that's going to be the case. You're not going to be afraid to ask a tough question, but also to put some pragmatic proposal on the table. And this conversation is going to continue about renewing our social contract as foundation. On June the 16th, we have our next webinar. I'm sorry it's going to conflict with some of the important work that Chris is doing at the Circle. But we're going to be presenting a brief to our members and to the wider public about the disbursement quota and try to open up that conversation. It should not be. So I'll give you a quick teaser about what's going to be in the paper, but the increase to disbursement quota has to be linked with enabling condition. One of them that you identify is like clearly is creating a level playing field between not-for-profits and charities. The second one is about at least tracking about the effective use of capital to support our mission. So over and beyond the granting, looking at investment side. And the third one is address the data deficit much more effectively. If not, some of the patterns that you already identified will just recreate them even with the increase in disbursement quota. So thanks a lot for that conversation, and thanks to you in particular, Chris, for being with us today at such a difficult time, and for you and your community. Very much appreciated, and that we standing with you and your peoples right now. It's a critical, as I said in my comments, it's a time of reckoning for Canada, and we stand with you. Donc, merci, and we'll see each other in 2 weeks from now.